The crying cut through the cabin like a siren that wouldn't shut off. Not the fussy kind. Not the bored kind. This was panic, ragged, breathless, desperate. The sound of a child who didn't understand where the ground had gone. Row 2. Window seat. Marco Bellini didn't move. Around him, the plane prepared for departure, seatbelts clicking, overhead bins slamming, the low mechanical hum rising in pitch. A flight attendant paused beside his row, smile frozen, eyes flicking from the screaming child to Marco's face. She lowered her voice instinctively, as if sound itself might provoke him. "Sir, would you like me to?" Marco raised one finger. She stopped. Luca thrashed in his seat, small fists clenched, heels drumming against the plastic. His face had gone red, then pale, then red again. Tears streaked down his cheeks, soaking into the collar of a shirt Marco had picked himself that morning. Expensive. Soft. Useless. Marco's hands stayed folded in his lap. People were staring now. Some with irritation. Some with judgment. One man 2 rows back muttered something under his breath. A woman across the aisle shifted sharply, already forming a complaint. Marco felt none of it. All his attention narrowed to the rise and fall of his son's chest, too fast, too shallow. The way Luca's eyes kept darting to the aisle, then the ceiling, then the window, as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. Marco leaned closer. "Luca." The boy didn't hear him. Marco tried again, lower. Controlled. The same tone he used in rooms where men decided whether others walked out alive. "Luca. Look at me." "Nothing." The crying climbed higher, sharper, scraping the nerves of everyone trapped inside the aluminum tube. A seatbelt sign chimed. The plane began to taxi. Marco's jaw tightened. 6 months ago, Luca had slept through fireworks. Thunder. Slamming doors. 6 months ago, he laughed easily, ate without fuss, clung to Marco only when tired. 6 months ago, Marco hadn't learned how quickly a child could change when the world proved it could hurt him. Marco reached out, placing a hand on Luca's knee. He didn't squeeze. He didn't pull. He waited. Luca screamed harder. The woman across the aisle snapped. "Do something." Marco turned his head slowly. He didn't glare. He didn't threaten. He simply looked at her. Whatever she saw there made her swallow the rest of her sentence. She turned away, cheeks burning. The crying didn't stop. Marco straightened, eyes forward now, posture rigid. He could feel the plane accelerating beneath them, the push back into his seat. He could feel eyes crawling over his shoulders. He could feel something worse than anger tightening his chest. Helplessness. Money had never failed him before. Neither had reputation. Or fear. Or preparation. He had planned this flight down to the minute, private transfer waiting on the other end, names rotated, phones powered down. California was supposed to be quiet. Neutral. Instead, his son was unraveling in front of 100 strangers, and Marco Bellini, who owned buildings, controlled routes, decided outcomes, couldn't fix it. A man in the aisle stood abruptly, flagging down a flight attendant. Another sighed loudly. Someone else laughed nervously, the sound thin and wrong. Luca kicked the tray table. The vibration rattled Marco's teeth. Marco leaned in close, lowering his voice to Luca's ear. "It's me," he said. "Papa's here." The word used to work. Luca's hands flew up, covering his ears. He shook his head violently, as if trying to dislodge the sound of the engines, the pressure, the memory only he could feel. Marco pulled back. For a split second, just a second, his control slipped. His fingers flexed, nails biting into his palm. His gaze swept the cabin, measuring distances, exits, threats that weren't there. Then he felt it. Someone watching. Not the annoyed glances. Not the curious ones. This was different. Still. Focused. Marco's eyes tracked the sensation down the aisle, past row numbers, past shifting bodies, until they stopped near the back of the plane. Seat 14C. A man sat there alone, hands resting on his thighs, spine straight. No headphones. No phone. His clothes were forgettable, dark hoodie, worn sneakers, but his attention wasn't scattered like everyone else's. It was locked on Luca. Not annoyed. not judgmental. Recognizing. The man stood. The movement cut through the noise like a blade. A few heads turned. A flight attendant took a step forward automatically, then hesitated when Marco glanced up at her. Marco didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He waited. The stranger walked forward at an unhurried pace, stopping 2 rows short of Marco. Close enough to be seen. Far enough to retreat. Up close, he looked ordinary. Late 30s, maybe? Dark hair cut too short to be fashionable. Eyes that didn't flicker when they met Marco's. The crying continued, unbroken. The man crouched slightly, lowering himself to Luca's eye level without touching anything. Without asking permission. "Hey," he said quietly. Not to Marco. To the child. The word was barely louder than the hum of the engines, but Luca's thrashing stuttered for half a beat. Marco's pulse jumped. The man held out his empty hands, palms visible. No sudden movements. No smile. "That sound you're making," he continued, voice steady, "means you're scared. Not bad. Not wrong. Just scared." Luca's scream hitched. The cabin seemed to lean in. Marco's instincts flared, every rule, every warning screaming at him to shut this down. He opened his mouth. The man slipped one hand into his pocket. Slowly. Deliberately. Marco's eyes dropped, tracking the movement. Calculating. The man withdrew a small object and set it gently on the tray table between them. Wood. Roughly carved. No paint. No shine. Worn smooth by years of handling. A figurine. Luca's crying stopped. Not faded. Not softened. Stopped. The silence was so abrupt it rang. Luca stared at the figurine, chest heaving once, twice. His fingers reached out, trembling, then closed around it. He pulled it to his chest, curling forward as if shielding it from the world. The plane exhaled. A few people clapped before catching themselves. The woman across the aisle stared openly now, confusion replacing irritation. The flight attendant covered her mouth, relief flickering across her face. Marco didn't move. He stared at the object in his son's hands. Because he had seen it before. Or one just like it. Years ago. In a kitchen that smelled of burnt coffee and fear. On a night when a different child had cried and Marco Bellini had made a decision that could not be undone. The stranger straightened, stepping back. Their eyes met. The man gave no smile. No nod. Just a look that said he knew exactly what he'd done. Then he turned and walked back toward the rear of the plane, disappearing into seat 14C as if nothing had happened at all. Marco's hand closed slowly around the edge of the tray table. The engines roared louder. And somewhere deep in his chest, something old and buried stirred, because Marco understood, with a clarity that chilled him, that this flight had already gone somewhere he hadn't planned to follow. Daniel Russo didn't sit back down right away. He paused in the aisle, just long enough to feel the weight of what he'd done settle into his bones. The plane kept moving, engines straining, the ground falling away beneath them. Somewhere behind him, a child breathed evenly for the first time since boarding. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second. Too late to undo it now. He slid into seat 14C and faced forward, hands resting flat on his thighs. The figurine was gone from his pocket. His chest felt hollow without it, like he'd left something vital behind on that tray table. Across the cabin, Marco Bellini hadn't looked away from his son. Luca sat curled in on himself, cheek pressed against the wood, fingers locked tight as if the plane might try to steal it back. His breathing slowed in visible increments, short, sharp pulls smoothing into something closer to sleep. Marco watched every detail. The way Luca's shoulders dropped. The way his jaw unclenched. The way his eyes stopped darting toward invisible exits. Marco hadn't asked the man's name. Hadn't thanked him. Hadn't ordered him away. That alone told Daniel everything. Men like Bellini didn't operate on politeness. Silence was currency. Allowance was consent. Daniel leaned his head back against the seat and stared at the ceiling panels. The vibration of the aircraft traveled through his spine, familiar and unwelcome. His pulse still hadn't slowed. He hadn't planned to intervene. He had boarded the plane with one goal: arrive unnoticed, leave unchanged. Connecticut was behind him now, supposedly. The name on his ticket wasn't his. The address wasn't real. The past was something he kept folded and compressed, like clothing shoved into a bag you never fully unpack. Then the crying started. At first, he told himself it was none of his business. Children cried on planes. Parents dealt with it. He kept his eyes on the safety card, counting the rivets along the fuselage in his peripheral vision, grounding himself the way he'd learned to do. But the sound didn't follow the usual pattern. It didn't rise and fall. It didn't spike and ease. It stayed sharp, unbroken, stripped of any rhythm except panic. Daniel's fingers had curled into his palms without him noticing. He knew that cry. Not from memory. Memory implied distance. This was recognition. 3 months earlier, he had stood in a hospital corridor in New Haven, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, listening to a sound almost identical. A sound that had echoed down white walls while adults argued quietly nearby. A sound that didn't stop when it should have. A sound that ended too suddenly. Daniel's jaw tightened now as turbulence rippled through the cabin, a soft shudder that made a few passengers gasp. Luca stirred but didn't wake, the figurine pressed to his chest like an anchor. The object itself was unremarkable to anyone else. Just wood. Just shape. Daniel had carved it years ago with a kitchen knife that barely held an edge. No pattern. No plan. Just hands moving because stillness felt dangerous. He hadn't meant to keep it. Hadn't meant to carry it across state lines under different names. Yet there it was, doing exactly what it had been made to do. Marco shifted in his seat. Not dramatically. Not enough to draw attention. But Daniel saw it anyway, the subtle angle of his shoulders, the way his head tilted just enough to study the aisle without turning fully around. Assessing. Daniel didn't look back. He kept his posture loose, unthreatening. He didn't fidget. Men like Bellini noticed that kind of thing. So did the people who worked for them. A flight attendant passed, offering drinks. She smiled at Daniel, then glanced instinctively toward row 2, where Luca slept. Her shoulders relaxed when she saw the calm. Water, Daniel said when she reached him. She handed it over. Her fingers shook slightly. He took one sip and set the cup down untouched. The water tasted like metal. From the corner of his eye, he saw Marco finally move. The man lifted the figurine gently, turning it over once in his hands before setting it back against Luca's chest. His touch was careful, reverent even. Too careful for a stranger's toy. Daniel's throat tightened. That figurine carried a mark burned into its base, small, uneven, almost accidental. A cross, crooked and imperfect. Daniel had made it without thinking, pressing heated metal into it on a night when thinking felt dangerous. Only one other man had ever seen it up close. Only one other man had let him walk away afterward. Daniel shifted in his seat, the leather creaking softly. He could feel the cabin air drying his eyes, his mouth. He welcomed the discomfort. It kept him present. A few rows ahead, a man leaned into the aisle and whispered something to his seatmate. They both glanced toward Marco, then quickly away. Recognition didn't spread like it used to. Not openly. But it moved in subtle ways, hesitations, lowered voices, sudden politeness. Marco Bellini was known in certain circles. Daniel hadn't expected to see him here. He certainly hadn't expected to see him with a child. The plane climbed steadily now, the city shrinking beneath cloud cover. Seatbelt lights flicked off. The hum of conversation resumed in cautious layers. Marco stood. The movement drew Daniel's attention instantly, every muscle in his body bracing despite his stillness. Marco stepped into the aisle and walked back, not fast, not slow. He stopped beside seat 14C. Up close, the man was taller than Daniel had remembered. Broader too. His suit jacket was perfectly fitted, dark fabric absorbing light. No visible jewelry. No flash. Just presence. Bridgeport, Marco said quietly. It wasn't a question. Daniel kept his eyes forward. Yes. You were there. Yes. A pause stretched between them, thin and taut. People passed behind Marco, unaware they were threading through a space thick with old decisions. You cost me money, Marco continued. Daniel nodded once. Yes. Marco's lips twitched, not quite a smile. You saved someone. Daniel's fingers tightened against his thighs. I did what was in front of me. Marco studied him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he sat in the empty aisle seat across from Daniel, turning his body just enough to block the view. You should not have that, Marco said, voice low. And my son should not have needed it. Daniel finally looked at him. Up close, Marco's eyes were darker than Daniel remembered. Older. There were lines at the corners now, earned rather than worn. Children don't choose when they need help, Daniel said. Marco's gaze flicked briefly toward row 2. No, he agreed. They do not. The plane shuddered again, light turbulence rippling through the cabin. Somewhere, a baby fussed briefly, then quieted. Marco leaned back, folding his hands in his lap, mirroring Daniel's posture without seeming to notice. You are flying to California, Marco said. So am I. Daniel said nothing. There are people, Marco continued, who would pay very well to know why my son stopped crying when nothing else worked. Daniel's jaw set. And there are people, Marco added, eyes steady now, who have been asking questions about my family. That was the moment the weight truly landed. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. Then you should keep him close. Marco's gaze sharpened. That is not what I asked. Silence pressed in again, heavier this time. Daniel measured his next move carefully. He had broken his rule once already. Breaking it twice could cost him more than anonymity. But the figurine wasn't just wood. And Luca's sleep wasn't just rest. You have a problem, Daniel said at last. One your reach can't solve. Marco didn't deny it. And you think I am the solution? Marco's eyes flicked, just briefly, to Daniel's chest, where the figurine had rested moments earlier. I think, Marco said, that you and I have already crossed a line. Daniel nodded once. The engines droned. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as they leveled off. Somewhere between the ground and cruising altitude, the past had caught up. And neither of them could pretend anymore that this was just a flight. Marco Bellini returned to row 2 without another word. He didn't look back. Didn't check whether Daniel watched him go. Men like Marco didn't confirm interest. They assumed it was already there. The aisle swallowed him, and the cabin closed ranks again, passengers resuming their private rituals, screens glowing, drinks lifted, conversations restarting in careful murmurs. Luca slept. Deep now. Heavy. The kind of sleep that pulled the lines from a child's face and made him look younger than his years. The figurine rested against his chest, rising and falling with each breath. Marco adjusted the seatbelt slightly so it wouldn't press into him during turbulence. His hands moved with surgical precision. Inside, nothing was calm. Marco's mind ran ahead of the plane, skipping across possibilities the way it always did when something went wrong. The stranger's voice. The figurine. The mark burned into the wood, crooked, unmistakable. He hadn't seen that symbol since Bridgeport. Since the night he'd made a decision that went against his own rules. He had never forgotten the face attached to that decision. He had just never expected to see it again. Marco settled back, eyes forward, posture relaxed enough to deceive anyone watching. His phone stayed dark in his pocket. He didn't call anyone. Not yet. Calling meant acknowledging uncertainty, and uncertainty spread if you weren't careful. He watched Luca's fingers twitch in sleep. 6 months ago, Marco had been elsewhere when things went wrong. Not far, just far enough to matter. He had arrived after the noise, after the broken glass, after the apologies that came too late to mean anything. Since then, Luca had clung tighter. Jumped at sounds. Woken screaming from dreams he couldn't explain. Doctors had offered words. Therapists had offered charts and timelines. None of it had stopped the crying. Until a man who should not exist anymore had stepped out of the aisle and done something Marco couldn't buy, threaten, or order. Marco's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the back of the plane, catching the edge of seat 14C in his peripheral vision. Daniel Russo sat still, hands folded, gaze unfocused as if watching something beyond the cabin walls. Waiting. Marco didn't like waiting. He reached up and adjusted the overhead air vent, angling it away from Luca's face. The movement was small, ordinary. Anyone watching would have seen a father making a minor adjustment. Only Marco felt the calculation beneath it. If Daniel had been found once, he could be found again. That meant someone had been careless. Or someone had wanted him found. Marco's fingers brushed the figurine as he checked Luca's seatbelt again. The wood was warm now, carrying Luca's heat. He turned it slightly, just enough to confirm what he already knew. The mark was still there. A cross, burned unevenly into the base. Not religious. Not symbolic in the way people like to pretend. It had been a signal once. A way of saying this debt ends here without witnesses. Marco had broken a pattern that night. Spared someone who, by every rule he'd grown up with, should not have walked away. The cost had been manageable then. Now, 6 months after everything else had gone wrong, that cost was resurfacing with teeth. The seatbelt sign chimed softly as turbulence rattled the cabin again. Luca shifted, but didn't wake. Marco placed a hand flat against his son's chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his palm. Steady. Alive. Here. A flight attendant paused nearby, pretending to check the overhead bins. Her eyes flicked to Luca, then to Marco's face. "He's doing better," she said, carefully neutral. "Yes," Marco replied. She lingered a moment, then moved on. Marco exhaled slowly through his nose. He could sense the plane's collective relief settling into something like normalcy. People relaxed when children stopped crying. They forgot quickly too. That forgetfulness was a luxury Marco didn't have. He shifted in his seat, angling his body just enough to see down the aisle again. Daniel had not moved. No phone. No drink. No attempt to blend in beyond simply existing. It was a mistake. Men who survived learned when to disappear. Marco catalogued the details without staring. Height. Build. The faint tension in Daniel's shoulders that hadn't eased even after the crisis passed. A man who had acted instinctively and now lived with the consequences of having done so. Marco respected that. He also understood what it usually cost. Time stretched. The plane leveled off fully, engines settling into a steady drone. Conversation picked up around them, a wash of sound that blurred into background noise. Marco waited 5 minutes. Then another. He didn't go back to Daniel. Not yet. He needed space for the truth to surface on its own. Instead, he pulled a leather notebook from his carry-on and opened it to a blank page. He didn't write names. He never did. Just dates. Places. Symbols. Bridgeport. A cross. 14C. He closed the notebook and slid it back into the bag. Across the cabin, Daniel shifted at last. Not dramatically. Just enough to stretch his legs into the aisle before pulling them back again. His gaze flicked briefly toward row 2, toward Luca. Marco felt it immediately. The attention. The awareness. Daniel looked away first. That was confirmation enough. Marco leaned back, folding his arms loosely. He allowed himself one long look at his son's sleeping face, memorizing it the way he had learned to do after the world proved it could take things without warning. Whatever this was becoming, it was no longer abstract. Someone had reached into Marco's life without permission. Someone had calmed his son when Marco could not. And somewhere between takeoff and cruising altitude, Marco Bellini had recognized something he hadn't felt in years, not fear, not anger, but the quiet certainty that a door he thought was sealed had just opened again. Whether it led to protection or disaster remained to be seen. The plane cut westward through the clouds. And neither man slept. The plane dimmed its cabin lights without ceremony. It wasn't night yet, but it was close enough that the glow softened faces and blurred edges. Screens flickered on. Trays dropped. People leaned back into the small relief of routine, grateful for anything that felt predictable again. Daniel Russo welcomed the dim. It gave him cover. He adjusted in his seat, rolling his shoulders once, slow and deliberate, as if loosening a knot. His body carried memory the way some people carried scars, quietly, invisibly, but always present. He could still feel the moment he'd stood in the aisle. The weight of eyes on him. The instant where choice narrowed to a single path and refused to widen again. He hadn't acted to be seen. That bothered him more than the attention itself. Across the cabin, Marco Bellini watched reflections instead of people. The faint mirror of the aisle light caught in the window beside him, showing fragments, his own eyes, Luca's sleeping face, shapes moving behind them. It reminded him of surveillance footage, never the full picture, always enough to be dangerous. Luca shifted in his sleep. Marco's hand moved instantly, steadying the figurine against his son's chest before it could slip. The gesture was automatic, practiced. A father's reflex layered over something sharper. He hadn't returned the figurine. Not yet. That, too, was a choice. Marco knew men who would have handled this differently. Louder. Faster. With questions that came wrapped in threats. Those men didn't last long anymore. They made too much noise. Noise attracted attention, and attention was expensive. Marco preferred pressure. He glanced toward the back again, just once. Daniel was staring at his hands now, thumbs brushing over his knuckles in a slow, absent pattern. Not nervous. Not fidgeting. Just grounding himself. As if staying present required effort. Marco filed that away. Time passed in fragments. A drink cart rattled. Someone laughed too loudly, then stopped when they realized no one joined in. The captain's voice crackled briefly over the intercom, announcing smooth skies ahead. Smooth skies were lies. They always were. Daniel leaned forward and rested his forearms on his thighs. His reflection appeared faintly in the darkened window, older than he felt, younger than he should have looked. A man suspended between versions of himself. He thought of the figurine again. He hadn't meant to give it away. He also knew he would do it again. That realization settled deeper than he expected. Somewhere behind him, a man cleared his throat. Another adjusted a seat. Life moved on in small, careless ways. Daniel wondered how many people on this flight believed they knew exactly who they were, what they would do under pressure, where their lines were drawn. He used to believe that too. Then came the nights where lines blurred. The mornings where consequences arrived before explanations. The moment in Bridgeport when he'd been forced to decide who he was without anyone watching. And now this. A child he didn't know. A father he did. A plane cutting across the country, indifferent to the weight it carried. Marco shifted again, crossing one leg over the other. His eyes remained forward, but his attention stretched, reaching backward through the cabin. He felt the pull of unfinished business the way some men felt hunger. He didn't regret sparing Daniel back then. What unsettled him was how little regret he felt now. Luca sighed softly in his sleep, fingers tightening briefly around the figurine before relaxing again. Marco watched it happen, something loosening in his chest that he didn't name. For a moment, just a moment, Marco allowed himself to imagine another version of things. One where power wasn't measured in leverage. One where problems didn't circle back years later wearing different faces. The thought passed quickly. Men like Marco didn't live in hypotheticals. Still, the quiet pressed in, and with it came a rare, uncomfortable pause. Not for the passengers, but for the listener. For anyone following this story, caught between breaths, between choices. Because moments like this weren't about mafia bosses or strangers on planes. They were about the split seconds where action revealed character. The times when no one was watching closely enough to reward you or punish you for what you chose to do. And if this moment, this small act with outsized consequences, stirred something familiar, if it reminded you of a choice you once made or didn't, then this story had already reached where it needed to. Stories like this don't survive on spectacle alone. They survive because someone feels seen enough to pause, to acknowledge it quietly. To signal, in their own small way, this mattered to me. A nod. A mark of support. A thought left behind in words about what they would have done differently or the same. The cabin lights remained low. The plane moved steadily west. And somewhere between reflection and resolve, Marco Bellini finally unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood, not to confront, not yet, but with purpose this time. With intention sharpened by patience. Daniel felt the shift before he saw it. The pressure was back. And whatever came next would not allow either of them to remain exactly who they were when they boarded. Marco Bellini didn't walk back immediately. He stepped into the aisle and paused, letting the movement register without explanation. People noticed posture before faces. Authority before identity. A few heads lifted. A few conversations stalled mid-sentence. Nothing dramatic, just the subtle adjustment of a room when gravity shifts. Daniel felt it like a pressure change. He didn't turn. He didn't tense. He adjusted his breathing instead, slow and measured, the way he had learned to do when reacting too quickly meant mistakes. His eyes stayed on the sea back in front of him, the worn safety card tucked halfway into its sleeve. Marco took one step, then another. Each footfall landed softly, controlled. No rush. No hesitation. By the time he reached row 14, the cabin had already accepted his presence as something inevitable. Marco stopped beside Daniel's seat. Not across the aisle this time. Beside him. Close enough that Daniel could smell the faint trace of cologne beneath recycled cabin air. Close enough that silence itself felt deliberate. Marco didn't sit. "You're heading west for a reason," he said quietly. Daniel kept his eyes forward. "Most people are." Marco's gaze flicked once toward the window, where cloud cover stretched endlessly below them. "Most people don't travel under borrowed names." Daniel's fingers twitched once, barely visible, but Marco caught it. "So you checked," Daniel said. "I verify," Marco corrected. Checking implies doubt. Daniel exhaled. "And what did you verify?" Marco leaned closer, resting one hand on the top of the seat in front of Daniel, boxing him in without touching him. "That you didn't disappear," Marco said. "You relocated." Daniel finally turned his head. Their eyes met. Up close, the space between them felt narrower than the aisle could explain. Old history compressed by altitude and circumstance. Men who understood consequences without needing them spelled out. "I stayed out of your way," Daniel said. Marco nodded once. "You did." A beat. "And now," Marco added, "you're back in it." Daniel's mouth tightened. "I didn't choose this." Marco's gaze drifted briefly toward row 2. Toward Luca. "Neither did he," Marco said. The words weren't raised. They didn't need to be. A flight attendant appeared at the far end of the aisle, hesitated when she saw Marco standing there, then turned away without comment. The message was received without being spoken. Marco straightened slightly. "You calmed my son," he said. "You didn't ask permission." Daniel shrugged. "There wasn't time." "No," Marco agreed. "There rarely is." Silence stretched again, heavier now, shaped by what neither man said. Marco studied Daniel's face, not for guilt, not for fear, but for fractures. For tells that suggested weakness or leverage. He didn't find what he expected. "What are you running from?" Marco asked. Daniel looked away first this time, not out of submission, but calculation. "If you already know my name," he said, "you already know the answer." Marco considered that. Slowly. "Some things," he said, "stop chasing you if you stop moving." Daniel's lips curved slightly, not a smile. "Some things catch up faster when you stand still." Marco's eyes sharpened. That answer pleased him more than it should have. He stepped back half a pace, giving Daniel space without surrendering control. The figurine was still with Luca. Marco could feel its absence like a weight in his pocket, a reminder of a debt neither of them had acknowledged yet. "I didn't come back here to threaten you," Marco said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Then you should work on your posture." Marco huffed quietly, a breath that might have been a laugh in another life. "I came back," Marco continued, "to make something clear." Daniel waited. "You stepped into my family's space," Marco said. "That creates a relationship." Daniel's jaw set. "I'm not interested." Marco nodded. "Interest isn't required." He leaned in again, lowering his voice further. "What matters is that there are people watching me right now," Marco said. "People who would see your presence on this plane as inconvenient." Daniel didn't respond. "And there are other people," Marco added, "who would see you as useful." There it was. The terms, laid out without contracts or demands. An offer shaped like a warning. Protection framed as inevitability. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "I'm not your man," he said. Marco studied him for a long moment. "No," Marco said slowly. "You're not." He straightened fully now, the conversation shifting with him. "But you're not invisible either." Marco turned to leave, then stopped. "One more thing," he said, without looking back. "California isn't as far as you think." Daniel watched him walk away this time. Watched the man return to his seat, adjust Luca's blanket, sit like nothing had happened. Watched power slip back into its place with practiced ease. The figurine remained. Daniel leaned back, heart steady but heavy. The terms had been set. Not spoken. Not signed. but unmistakable all the same. And somewhere over the Midwest, with the plane pressing forward and the past no longer content to stay buried, Daniel understood one thing with absolute clarity. This wasn't about what he'd done. It was about what Marco Bellini now believed he might be capable of doing next. The car slowed before the gate finished opening. Marco noticed first. He always did. The driver's foot eased off the pedal without being told, the engine dropping into a quiet, obedient hum. Two men stood where there should have been none, dark jackets, hands visible, posture too relaxed for staff. Not guards. Not strangers either. Daniel felt it a second later. That prickle at the back of the neck. The sense that the air had shifted. Marco didn't look at them right away. He studied the reflection in the tinted window instead, jaw set, breath measured. The house lights beyond the gate glowed warm and inviting, but the road behind them had gone cold. "Keep rolling," Marco said softly. One of the men raised a hand. The car stopped anyway. Silence pressed in. Not the quiet of peace, this was the quiet that waits to see who moves first. Marco finally stepped out. The night swallowed half of him as soon as his shoes hit the gravel. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, shoulders squared, presence heavy enough to bend the moment around him. "You're early," he said. The taller man smiled without warmth. "Schedules change." Daniel stayed inside, but his eyes tracked everything, the angle of the men's shoulders, the way one of them kept glancing past Marco toward the car. Toward him. That wasn't an accident. Marco shifted, just enough to block the line of sight. "Messages come through me," Marco said. "You know that." The smile faded. "This one's not just for you." A pause. Then, deliberate and sharp, "Bridgeport isn't buried." Daniel's fingers curled against his thigh. Marco didn't turn around, but something in him hardened. Like stone cooling after fire. "Careful," he said. "Or what?" the man replied. "You'll pretend you don't hear us too?" The gate creaked as the wind nudged it. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. Ordinary sounds. Wrong moment. Marco took one step forward. That single step did more than shouting ever could. "You came to warn me," Marco said. "Which means you're not here to start anything." "Not tonight." The second man shifted his weight. Nervous. Young. The taller one exhaled through his nose. Word travels. People notice patterns. Old debts resurfacing. Old names spoken again. Marco's voice dropped. "Then tell them this. I decide what stays buried." The man studied him for a long second, then nodded once. "We'll see." They stepped back into the dark as easily as they'd arrived, swallowed by the road behind them. Marco didn't move until the gate finished closing. Only then did he turn. His eyes met Daniel's through the open door. Nothing was said, but everything had changed. Because now Daniel knew. This wasn't just about the past knocking softly. It was about how loud it might get. Marco returned to the car and shut the door himself. The driver didn't ask questions. Neither did Daniel. The vehicle rolled forward again, but the road no longer felt contained. It felt exposed. As the house came into view, lights steady against the dark, Daniel watched the world slide past the window and thought about how moments like this never belonged to just one place. Someone, somewhere else, was sitting in their own quiet right now, listening, watching, feeling the weight of a choice they hadn't made yet. And if this story is unfolding where you are too, if it's finding you late at night or early morning in a room like this one, maybe say where you're watching from. Not because it changes what happens next, but because it reminds us none of us are really alone when a story reaches us this way. The car disappeared into the driveway. Behind it, the road stayed dark. The estate was quiet, but Daniel could feel the hum beneath the calm, the hidden pulse of a place that had seen loyalty tested and rules bent too many times. Marco led him down the stone path to the main house, his steps deliberate, heavy with authority. Daniel followed, careful not to let fear show. Every corner of the estate seemed mapped in Marco's mind, every shadow measured, every potential intruder accounted for. Inside, the house smelled of old leather and polished wood. Luca slept in a nearby room, the faint sound of his breathing a tether for Daniel. The figurines still rested on the windowsill, catching the last glow of street lamps. A knock echoed from the front door. Marco's jaw tightened. He moved faster than a man his size should have, opening the door before the second tap landed. A woman stood there, mid-30s, confident, eyes scanning the hall before they landed on Marco. Her smile was careful, knowing, as if she had been expected. "Marco," she said softly. "I believe you're looking for someone who can help." Daniel frowned. He wasn't sure if the words were meant for Marco or for him. Marco's posture didn't change, but Daniel could sense the shift in energy. The woman was ordinary in appearance, but her presence carried weight. She moved with the ease of someone used to bending situations to her will without anyone noticing. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, stepping closer. The woman didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she turned her attention to Marco. "Your situation isn't just a matter of family now," she said. "There are complications that even you can't control." Daniel noticed Marco's hand tighten around the doorframe. He rarely showed surprise, but there was something in her tone and knowledge that caught him off guard. "I didn't ask for help," Marco said. His voice was firm, but there was an edge Daniel hadn't heard before. "You'll take it," she replied. "Because ignoring this doesn't erase it. And it will come back to hurt the people you care about most." Daniel felt a chill. Marco's eyes flicked toward him briefly, and for the first time, Daniel saw uncertainty there. Not fear, not weakness, just a rare acknowledgement that even he might need outside hands. The woman stepped inside. Daniel watched as she scanned the room, resting her gaze briefly on Luca. A subtle nod, a small smile, almost unnoticed. She knew the boy's importance. She understood the stakes. Marco didn't speak for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Names first. Then solutions." The woman's eyes glinted with purpose. "Call me Elena. And I think you'll want to hear what I have to offer." Daniel couldn't move his gaze away. He felt the balance of power shift again, quietly, subtly, without anyone raising a weapon. Because in this house, in this world, power wasn't only measured by strength or fear. Sometimes, it was measured by who could step into the space no one else could reach and stay there unshaken. Daniel swallowed. The tension in the air wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about what could happen next and whether he, Marco, or anyone in this room could control it. The figurine on the windowsill seemed to gleam under the light, as if acknowledging that alliances were forming, decisions were being made, and consequences were about to unfold in ways no one had yet imagined. And somewhere deep inside, Daniel realized he was no longer just an observer. He was part of the equation. Chapter 8: The Ticking Shadow. The night air felt heavier than usual, almost sticky, as if the estate itself had been holding its breath. Daniel could hear his own heartbeat in the quiet hallways, a sharp contrast to the low hum of the city beyond the gates. Luca stirred in his sleep, a soft whimper escaping his lips. Daniel instinctively went to him, adjusting the blanket and brushing back the strands of hair from the boy's forehead. The small movement reminded him of the first night he had calmed Luca on the plane. The memory was both comforting and unsettling. The stakes had only grown since then. A sudden click echoed from the main entrance. Daniel froze. The sound was precise, deliberate, a lock disengaging that should have remained untouched. He wasn't sure if it came from skill, technology, or sheer audacity, but instinct told him it wasn't friendly. Marco appeared beside him before Daniel could speak. No footsteps, no warning, just presence. "They're here," Marco said softly, eyes scanning the hall. "I knew someone would try something once word got out." Daniel followed Marco toward the drawing room. Elena had already positioned herself near the windows, peering into the darkness. She didn't flinch, didn't step back. Her calm unnerved Daniel more than the threat itself. "They're testing you," Marco said, almost to himself. "To see how fast you react. To see what you'll protect and what you won't." A shadow shifted outside, barely visible through the blinds. Another followed. "Do they know he's in here?" Daniel asked, voice tight. Marco didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder as they moved through the hall, the gesture both protective and instructive. "They know," he said finally. "And that's why they'll wait. They'll make their move when you're most vulnerable." The car alarm in the distance screamed once, short and sharp. Daniel's stomach dropped. The warning was clear. The line between inside and outside had disappeared. Suddenly, a metallic clink came from the kitchen, too deliberate to be accidental. Daniel tensed, ready to react, but Marco's hand pressed lightly against his chest. Stop. Wait. The sound repeated, this time closer, more deliberate. Then a soft knock at the pantry door. Elena moved first, gliding silently across the polished floor. She opened the door with the precision of someone who had practiced this 1,000 times. Inside, a small device blinked red surveillance, recording every movement, every word, every breath. They're watching, she said, calm but sharp. Everything. Daniel felt the weight of it. Someone had anticipated this, had planned to infiltrate without anyone knowing, not even Marco, whose life had been spent predicting every move of his enemies. A pause. Which means they're closer than we think, Marco said. Daniel's mind raced. He thought of the plane, the journey, Luca's soft cries, the subtle unspoken terms set between him and Marco. Every decision now mattered. Every step could cost more than just information. Then Elena looked at him. Daniel, she said, voice low but unwavering. You need to understand. You're part of this now. Not just Marco. Not just Luca. You. Daniel swallowed hard, the air thick in his throat. The room seemed smaller, yet heavier, every shadow stretching like a warning. And in that moment, Daniel realized the unspoken truth. They were trapped in a countdown they couldn't see ticking, but one that was about to explode. Outside, a car engine revved faintly, echoing against the distant walls. The first wave had begun. Daniel glanced at the window, seeing only darkness, but feeling the inevitability. Somewhere beyond the estate, someone was waiting for the exact moment to strike. And this time, there would be no warning, no mercy, no second chance. Chapter 9: Collision Course. The first explosion came not with fire or noise, but with movement, subtle, almost invisible to anyone not looking. Daniel noticed it first, the faint shimmer of heat along the driveway, the shifting shadow of a car sliding into position behind the thick hedges. The engine wasn't loud, but it hummed with intent, a predator circling before the strike. Marco's hand landed on his shoulder, firm and unyielding. Get Luca, he said. No questions, no hesitation. The boy was already awake, eyes wide, sensing the tension. Daniel scooped him up instinctively, the child's small weight grounding him even as adrenaline spiked. Outside, Elena moved with precision, positioning herself where she could see every approach. Daniel followed her gaze, realizing in a split second that multiple figures were converging on the estate, silent, methodical, deliberate. They came prepared, she said, voice calm but clipped. This isn't just testing. This is extraction. Marco stepped forward, and for the first time, he wasn't untouchable. His usual control, the power he wielded over friends and enemies alike, had limits here. These intruders didn't care about fear. They didn't respect his authority. They only wanted results. The front door shook with a firm impact. Then another. And another. Daniel felt Luca tighten against him, the boy's soft whimpers pressing against his chest. He tried to steady his own breathing, but the sharp scent of fear, metallic, cold, filled the air. Stay low, Marco ordered, sliding a hand along the wall, pulling Daniel and Luca toward the back corridor. Do not come into the open. Not until I give the word. The sounds outside escalated, shouts, muffled commands, the sharp click of boots against stone. One of the intruders slipped past the side gate, invisible until the motion sensor flared and a soft red light lit their face, a young man, tense, trained. He froze when he saw Marco. The first shot rang out, not loud, but enough to shatter the fragile silence of the estate. Marco's figure moved like a predator in moonlight, positioning, guiding, controlling, yet even he couldn't cover every angle at once. Daniel pressed Luca closer, whispering through tight teeth, "It's okay, we're okay," though he wasn't sure if that was true. A second intruder appeared near the garage. Elena intercepted him, a swift move that disarmed without a struggle, but the momentary confrontation revealed the depth of their planning. They weren't improvising. They had intelligence. They had stakes. Marco's eyes flicked to Daniel. "You're part of this," he said. Do not freeze. Watch. Learn. Protect. Daniel did. He caught every detail, the timing, the positioning, the way Marco's calm masked a mind calculating every possible outcome. He felt something shift inside him, fear transforming into purpose, vulnerability into agency. Then came the breach, a small explosion by the rear gate. Smoke poured in, thick, curling, filling the hallways with choking haze. Daniel's first instinct was to shield Luca, but Marco's voice cut through the roar. Move. Now. They ran through the smoke, twisting down corridors, every corner a new question, every shadow a threat. Daniel caught glimpses of figures moving outside, of lights flashing, of the men who thought they could take the estate and fail. A crash behind them shook the floorboards. Luca whimpered. Daniel turned, caught Marco's gaze, and understood without words they couldn't all make it through this unscathed. Elena guided them to a concealed exit, one Daniel hadn't known existed. As the night swallowed them, Daniel felt the stakes in full. The world outside wasn't just dangerous. It was unforgiving. And in that moment, he realized the power they had relied on, Marco's authority, Elena's skill, even Daniel's courage, was fragile, conditional, and incomplete. Someone would have to make a choice that could not be undone. As they reached the outer perimeter, Daniel glimpsed movement in the trees, a shadow pausing, watching, waiting. And he understood that the real test, the one that would decide who survived, who fell, and who changed forever, was about to begin. Chapter 10, The Last Choice. The estate lay in ruins, or close enough that Daniel could barely recognize the paths they'd walked hours ago. Smoke curled from broken lamps, shards of glass reflected the moonlight in jagged patterns, and the distant hum of engines still lingered like ghosts. Marco stood at the center of it all, Luca in his arms, eyes scanning every shadow. His jaw was tight, hands steady, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the exhaustion of every choice he had made tonight. Daniel approached cautiously, every step measured. He had learned the rhythm of this world, the subtle shifts, the unspoken rules, the invisible weight of power. But nothing could prepare him for what came next. A figure emerged from the trees, the taller intruder from before, bloodied but unbowed. In one hand, a gun aimed straight at Marco. In the other, a folder of documents, evidence, leverage. End of the line, the man said. His voice was cold, mechanical, devoid of hesitation. Daniel's heart raced. Marco's hand moved subtly, brushing Luca's back, a silent command. Stay back. You don't have to do this, Daniel said, stepping slightly forward. He felt the weight of his own voice, small but defiant. Marco's gaze didn't waver. I make the choice, he said. But even his voice carried the strain of the night, the endless calculations of risk and loyalty, love and survival. The intruder smirked. Choice? You've had one chance. Now it's over. Your family, your empire, your boy gone if you hesitate. Time stretched. The only sound was Luca's soft breathing, the distant echo of collapsing gates, and the faint shuffle of feet. Then it happened. The moral test. Marco raised his hand, not toward the gun, not toward the man, but toward himself. The offer was clear. Take what he could, end the threat, exact revenge. One pull of the trigger, and everything would be over. Daniel saw the internal struggle flicker in his eyes, the predator of 1,000 streets, the man who had built power on fear and precision, now facing a choice that no muscle, no weapon, no connection could solve. Elena. Marco's voice was rough, almost a whisper. She stepped forward, calm, unwavering. Do what preserves you. Do what preserves him, she said, glancing at Luca. But don't become the monster he expects. Marco's eyes softened as he looked at Daniel. You understand why? Daniel nodded. He did. The weight of the night, the stakes, the fragility of power, it all led to this. And then, Marco lowered his hand. Not a word. Not a shot fired. Instead, he stepped toward the intruder, hands open, offering negotiation, offering mercy, but on his terms. The intruder froze, blinking. No one had ever done that before. Power without violence. Authority without blood. After a tense pause, the man dropped the gun, the folder clattering to the floor. He backed away, eyes wary, disappearing into the shadows as silently as he had arrived. Daniel exhaled, the first real breath of the night. Luca stirred, safe in Marco's arms. Elena gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and turned toward the hallway. It's done. For now. Marco finally lowered his gaze to Daniel. This changes nothing in the world outside. But it changes us. And that is enough for tonight. Daniel felt the tension melt slowly, replaced by something fragile and unexpected: hope. They had survived. Not by power alone. Not by fear. By choice. By restraint. By understanding the weight of what mattered most. Outside, the estate was quiet again. Smoke drifted lazily into the sky. Stars reflected off broken windows, reminding Daniel that, even in darkness, light found a way through. Luca yawned, soft and content, finally at peace. Marco's grip on him was tender, protective. Daniel watched, realizing that the boy and the man were more than the sum of threats, enemies, and violence. They were resilient, alive, whole. And in that stillness, Daniel knew that the story they had lived tonight, every shadow, every threat, every choice, would ripple far beyond the walls of the estate. For anyone watching, listening, following along, you've borne witness. And in some way, that makes you part of it too. Because in the end, survival wasn't just about fighting. It was about choosing humanity when the world demanded monsters. And the night, for now, let them keep that humanity.